Welcome back to our Christian Studies class. In this week's lecture, we are going to cover Paul and the epistles, that is, the letters he wrote to the early churches. So let's take a look at these together. Paul was born in a city called Tarsus, which is in modern-day Turkey, relatively close to Damascus, which comes up often in his life and in his letters. He was raised as a Jew, and Paul talks about this in the book of Philippians, chapter 3, where he talks about his Jewish pedigree. In other words, he was a thorough Jew. He was circumcised on the 8th day. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. This has been a faithful tribe mostly throughout biblical literature. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, he was a Pharisee, which means that he was very pious and strict. He was zealous for the traditions of Jews and a persecutor of Christians. According to the law, he was righteous. So Paul was a Jew who took his faith very, very seriously. We also see this in the book of Acts, where he's talking in court about how he's a Jew. He was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, who is a famous rabbi in Jewish literature. He was very, very strict and zealous. So we see that Paul is a Jew of Jews, a Hebrew of Hebrews among his people. As far as his upbringing, he already alluded to that in the last couple verses, but he studied under Gamaliel the First, who is a very famous rabbi. We learn about him from the Mishnah, which is the oral law of Jews, which is put into a book around the 2nd century AD. So when you see Jesus arguing with the Pharisees in the Gospels, he's typically arguing about their interpretation of the law, namely those laws that became codified in the Mishnah. We also learn about Gamaliel, Paul's teacher, from the Talmud, which is another book from the 5th century AD, which kind of elaborates and gives commentary to the Mishnah. And in both of these Jewish books, we learn that Gamaliel was a very pious, pure rabbi who had a lot of reverence for the law. Paul was quite competent intellectually. It seems like he was trilingual in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. He was also quite zealous for Judaism, as we've already seen, as a persecutor of the church. He was there when Stephen was martyred and gave his approval to do so. And then he got letters from the high priest to go to Damascus and persecute the church even more there. And that's when we see in the book of Acts, on his way to persecute the church and to put more Christians in prison, that we see a grand conversion. We see Jesus appear to Saul personally and announce that he is God, and that Saul is kicking against Jesus. And after seeing this and becoming convinced that Jesus truly is the Son of God, he goes into Damascus blind, and God tells one of the Christians to go restore Paul's sight and baptize him, which is really crazy because this disciple knows that Paul is coming to persecute them, and he's afraid. But he goes and he baptizes him, and that leads to this 3-year experience of Paul being in Arabia, the desert, relearning the doctrine of Judaism and becoming convinced that Christianity indeed is the proper climax and interpretation of the Jewish hope. So we see his conversion, and we also see his commission. Him and Barnabas were some of the first missionaries sent out to take the gospel to new places. So at this point in the book of Acts, the gospel has spread from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria, It has kind of infiltrated other places, like with Cornelius, and through Pentecost when Jews take the gospel to the ends of this earth. But Paul and Barnabas really are those first ones sent out from the church of Antioch to take the gospel to unreached places. And this kind of has a little map about, Paul got those letters from Jerusalem and going up to Damascus. So this is some of Paul's early life, kind of getting us an idea of where geographically he was operating. Now, Paul's personal life, we don't know a ton about it. We do know that he is not married. He mentions this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we're not sure why. It's possible that his wife passed away. It's unlikely that his wife divorced him for being a Christian, but I guess it's possible. But it's also possible, and probably more likely, that he never married. And this seems to be the best candidate because of how he talks about marriage in his writings. We also see that he suffered a lot. We see that he experienced beatings from the Jews. He was beaten 3 times with rods. He was shipwrecked 3 times. Once he spent night and day at sea adrift. We see that he's been susceptible to robbers and all kinds of dangers. So Paul, in his conversion to Christianity, was not a conversion to maximize his present life as if he was going to live his best life now. His conversion to Christianity coincided and really produced in him all kinds of suffering. So we see that Paul suffered much for becoming a Christian. Paul wrote 13 letters of the New Testament. He wrote many of them through a word that's called a amanuensis, which is basically somebody who wrote down the words of Paul. So we see that Peter also used this. Like Peter and Paul dictated their letters to somebody who then wrote them down. The letters are all occasional. They're not like a systematic theology. Rather, they are written to address specific issues going on in specific churches, and that's what we mean by them being occasional documents. They all have a typical form, namely a salutation, a main body, and a closing, where Paul might say things like, "Greet so and so for me," and the people here send their greetings as well in a benediction. Some modern scholars contest some of Paul's writings, like 1st and 2nd Timothy, for example, but there's no reason for us to doubt that these are written by the Apostle Paul, the Hebrew of Hebrews, who was converted on his way to Damascus to persecute the church. We have already talked about Paul's missionary journeys. There are several. Typically, they're categorized as 3, but it's possible that there are more. And during his first missionary journey, that's when he wrote his first letter, or the letter that's most likely the first one, Galatians. He wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians during his second missionary journey, 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans during the third, and then while in prison in Rome around AD 60, he wrote what's known as the prison epistles, and later the pastoral epistles, likely when he's still in prison. Remember that Jesus was crucified around 33 AD, so Paul's first letter is about 15 years or so after Jesus' crucifixion. We've already talked about Paul being commissioned to the mission field. He was definitely a missionary. We learn in passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 9 about his desire to win people to Jesus at all costs. He becomes a Jew to the Jews and a Gentile to the Gentiles in order to win people to Jesus. We also read about in Romans 15 that Paul didn't want to just win people to Jesus. He wanted to win people who had never heard the name of Jesus before. So Paul, in the book of Romans, wants to go to Spain to take the gospel to the Iberian Peninsula, a place that had not yet heard about the name of Jesus. And his reasoning is that I have planted churches and I have preached throughout the entire region of Israel and the entire region of Turkey, Asia Minor, and now I want to take the gospel to where it's never been preached before. So it is very appropriate to see Paul as a missionary. Here again is a graphic illustrating Paul's missionary journeys. Notice how they're all starting in Antioch, a very multi-ethnic missional church that because of this church, look at where the gospel spread and what a vision to our churches today that if we embraced the mission like the Church of Antioch, we could just imagine on how much more progress we can make in taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. Now, here's a basic Pauline chronology, starting with when he became a Christian shortly after the crucifixion, and then several trips down to Jerusalem. We see in yellow, it's probably hard to see, but his first missionary journey, his second, his third, taken to Rome under house arrest. And these dates get a little less clear, but these are good estimations. Another aspect about Paul's life that's really significant is Paul as a mentor. We see that when he went on missionary journeys, he took people with him, including Timothy, who later became a pastor in Ephesus. We also see how he took along Silas and Luke. We see his letters to both Timothy and Titus. Timothy is pastoring in Ephesus and Titus is pastoring in Crete, and we see him mentoring and caring for his disciples or his mentees in a way about how to lead the church in Paul's absence. So Paul took this very, very seriously, this idea of leaving a legacy of gospel influence for the sake of the mission of God. Paul had many opponents. We see Judaizers. These are a group of people with a Jewish background who are heavily focused on Jewish culture. So we learn about in the book of Galatians how people from Jerusalem, called Judaizers, have come and enforced in the church of Galatia laws about separating Jews and Gentiles at mealtime, which is very significant. When Judaizers say Jews and Gentiles can't eat together, it's not just an issue of friendship. It's an issue that somehow the Gentiles are still unclean, that somehow there's still something that is separating them from God and treating them at best like second-class citizens, at worst as those who are still outside of the covenant of faith. And so Paul, in his writings, really opposes the Judaizers in books like Galatians and Ephesians and Colossians in saying that that dividing wall of hostility, namely those laws that separated Jews and Gentiles, has been torn down, that Jesus might make a new man. So one of his opponents is Judaizers who have misunderstood the significance of what Jesus does to the Old Testament law. Like he truly fulfills it and makes it go away so that God's people can now be under a new law. There are opponents who don't understand, like in Iconium, who believe that Paul is a god and they want to worship him. And when Paul forbids this, they then want to stone him. We see Romans that, for example, in Acts 28, who don't understand the message that's being preached. We see in Romans as well people being frustrated about the civil unrest that's being caused by Paul's proclamation. We see this in the book of we see this in the book of Acts when Paul is ministering to the Ephesians as well, namely the pagans who are worshiping statues, while those craftsmen who make those statues aren't very happy about people becoming Christians because now they're no longer buying their statues. So you have people who are mad because of economic reasons. And then there's spiteful and competitive believers who are preaching the same message as Paul, but out of selfish ambition. So we see lots of opponents in Paul's ministry. And then ultimately, Paul's fate, according to Eusebius, an early church father, says that Paul was beheaded in Rome under Nero's persecution. So Nero was a tyrant. He led Rome from 54 to 68 A.D. and really persecuted Christians, even using Christians as human torches. And it is in this context that church history tells us that Paul was beheaded for the faith. So we're about ready to get into Paul's epistles, but it's helpful for us to see his life from beginning to end. In our next lecture, we'll get going in the book of Romans.